Welcome to An Unconventional Life, a podcast where we share stories about the crazy 1% out there who earned their doctoral degrees and then went on to use them in crazy, cool, unique, and unconventional ways. Here's your host, astrophysicist turned teacher, author, dissertation coach, and more, Dr. Russell Strickland.
Welcome to An Unconventional Life. This is Dr. Russell Strickland, founder and CEO of Dissertation Done, and your host here today. Today, I have with me Dr. Matthew Montgomery. Dr. Montgomery is a shining example of someone who really fast-tracked his career. He's currently a superintendent in the state of Ohio and has some interesting stories to tell about how they're handling. We're in the middle of the COVID crisis. I hope that we're in the middle or past the middle as we record this. And he's going to share some of that with you. But he has gone up the ranks in education from being a teacher, a principal, a superintendent, rose through those ranks very quickly, earned his Ph.D. along the way, and he'll tell you if he did that quickly or not as we talk. But I can't wait for our discussion here with Dr. Matt. I also want to thank Dr. Mike Lubbofield, one of our previous guests, for introducing us. So shout out to him. And today's episode, as always, is brought to you by Dissertation Done. If you're working on your dissertation, you're an adult struggling through the dissertation process, or you're about to face the dissertation process, and you'd like someone to provide some accountability, some guidance and direction, a proven path to get you from here to graduation as quickly as possible, reach out to us at dissertationdone.com/done. That's dissertationdone.com/done. And if by any chance you've actually graduated, finished your dissertation, and you're out there living your unconventional life, why don't you consider getting your message out there in a book? We can help you out through our Expand Your Authority program at dissertationdone.com/book. So again, Dr. Matt, thank you so much for joining us. I'm so glad to have you here today. How are you doing?
Well, let me begin by thank you for having me, Russ. It's exciting to talk about this, especially after it's complete. So there's a great deal of joy in my life right now, and I'm happy to share that message in the trials and tribulations. So I appreciate you giving me this opportunity to be with you today.
You're welcome. You're absolutely welcome. And when we say complete, recently complete, tell folks, how long ago was it that you defended and graduated?
So I defended in May 13th of this year. So it was in the throes of the pandemic. It was a virtual defense, which was interesting in its own right. And then ultimately a virtual graduation in August. So fresh off of the PhD and still licking the wounds back into reality.
So guys, you know there's going to be some realism and some emotion as we talk about this dissertation journey, because here he is, as we're recording right now, we're early in October in 2020. So hopefully this episode will be out there a long time from now, and you guys will faintly and fondly remember the pandemic and how we handled that. Let's hope, cross fingers. But Dr. Montgomery was actually completing his dissertation during this pandemic while still working in the school system, no less, as a superintendent. So I can't wait to get that story out to you. But let's go ahead and backtrack a little bit and tell me about why you decided to pursue this path in the first place. Okay, this is not a decision that most reasonable people make. 99% of the population never really tries, or certainly doesn't succeed in earning a doctoral degree. What made you decide to take the plunge?
Well, so I've always wanted to get a PhD ever since I started, ever since I became an actual teacher at that point. But even when I was going through my undergrad, I always looked to those doctors that inspired me and hoped that one day I could do that. And as a lifelong educator, it's overused, it's cliche, but it's a calling for me, which is also a cliche, but it's true. I feel it and breathe it every day. And to fulfill that for my own personal belief system, I wanted to go as far as I could in this career, and I thought the doctorate was the shining capstone to that experience. You're right. I don't think a lot of people do it. It's the same reason that I run marathons. It's just something that is challenging and difficult, and it's something that excites me to be able to be immersed in something that a lot of people don't do or haven't succeeded in, or I think that I can't when I take the first step.
Well, I tell you, I hear a similar story when I ask people why they decided to pursue this, and to me, it comes down to what I've identified as identity. I think that this is something that we somehow attribute to ourselves before we ever even start the doctoral journey. That's what I am. I am a doctor, and I just have to go out and do the work to make that happen, to get the credential, to back it up. But that's who I am. And I know personally, I've talked about this on the podcast before. I actually began my doctoral journey straight out of college, and hit some bumps along the way. My research advisor died, and I decided at that point, well, maybe it's not for me. I'm going to move away and actually make a little money instead of being dirt poor as a graduate student. And it wasn't long before that calling, as you put it, came back, because I think that's what I identify as, and I had to finish it. I had to get it done for my own sort of psychological well-being. It's who I thought I was, and if I didn't do it, there would always be a conflict. So I don't know if I feel that way as well when you mention calling.
Yeah, there's a lot of times, quite frankly, and it was a long experience, so 10 years of this process, not active writing. So rest assured that it wasn't that long for writing, but it was a start and stop. It was a lot of the coursework I found quite easy, not in an egotistical way, just that it was structured and there were deadlines and it was purposeful, and it was checking off boxes and learning along the way.
This again is a very common conclusion people draw, and I liken it to the fact that you have more in common with your last class you take in your doctoral program and what you were doing in third grade than what you're doing for your dissertation. Because in third grade, and my youngest child's not that far removed from it now, they start talking about we're no longer learning to read, but we're reading to learn. And once you do that, they tell you to read something, write something about it. It gets to be more and more significant what you're writing and what you're reading as you go through the process. But it's that same structure that you mentioned that's there throughout. And then with the dissertation, it just
yeah, it's like I know how to play school, right? I know how to play school. That's what I do for a living. So that part I very much enjoyed. The dissertation was that phase was much more challenging. In fact, I would argue for me at this point, being fresh off of it, it's the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. And that's not to say it can't be done, but that's what it was for me. And I will tell you, there's lots of times where I thought maybe I should walk away. Yeah, but it was always on my shoulder, always a cloud over me. And I heard this a lot from other folks, that whenever I wasn't working on it, I felt like I should be working on it. And there was that constant portion of my conscience that said that this should be something I'm focused on, and why are you enjoying yourself doing something else? Right. And maybe you should hang it up. But I couldn't do that. It was something that it wasn't for anything other than my own personal satisfaction that I was able to do it.
Yeah, I would say that Jewish mothers and Catholic priests have nothing on doctoral students when it comes to guilt.
I have a Catholic mother, so
all the time it feels like you should be.
Yeah, my mother has got the Catholic guilt under control. I love her dearly, but that's how I was raised. So I guess I was prepped already for the dissertation work.
Already ready for it. I remember one of my students from Dissertation done commenting on when she finished her this was a few years ago, when she finished her dissertation and defended. I asked her, well, what are you going to do now? And she said, I'm going to go to the football game and I'm not going to feel guilty about it. She actually worked for a small school, and they had a Division II football team or something like that. And they wanted as many of the faculty to be out there supporting them, because no one else was. It wasn't like they had a huge fan base or something. It was a community. It was a family. And she's like, I'm going to go out there because that's what we do. And I'm not going to feel guilty about it this time, for the first time in a couple of years. So
the new guilt is now, what are you going to do with it? So I think that that mindset is always there for me. So it's been interesting, but I don't feel badly because I'm not working on it anymore, because it's over.
Right. Weight off your shoulders. And that's huge. Yeah. Another one of my students, who actually was a guest on the podcast a few weeks ago, When I asked him what was the best part about graduating, he told me, Dr. Strickland, I got my life back. And that's how he described it, because it's almost like it's not you when you're in this process. There's just so much weight and so much stress. It's like, if you've seen the Snickers commercials, right, where they have this child or something like that, and football pads, and they're crying or whatever, and he says, hey, eat a Snickers bar, and then all of a sudden it's this big football dude again. It's like, you're not you when you're on the dissertation.
Yeah, I was Betty White or Aretha Franklin in those commercials more often than not, and I needed this badly.
So well,
you're right. I felt like I got my life back. It's interesting with children, and a father, that weight on you, that there were times because of my career choice that there's not a lot of free time during the day, right, that I had to dedicate family time to writing or reading. And it's almost as if they just knew that. I think sometimes in the last month or so, they wish I was reading or writing something because I've been far more attentive. But it did feel like I came alive a little bit more as a father with the completion.
Yeah, my timing was that we had, my wife and I joked that our firstborn child was born 5 years past his due date, because we had a lot of trouble starting off there. But he was actually born in December, and I defended my dissertation in April. But it was all done except for the paperwork, so to speak, the getting the I's dotted and the T's crossed really by the time he was born. And honestly, I don't know exactly what I would have done if it had been a couple of years later, because it's a lot to juggle that. But
I have a 10-year-old, a 9-year-old, a 7-year-old, and a 6-year-old. So these babies are wonderful, and I did my best during this time, but I definitely, that was part of the sacrifice. Yeah. There was some time with them that I could not give to them because I was hidden in a Barnes & Noble or a Starbucks or a park or in the basement hiding writing.
Right. No, I definitely understand. Now, you mentioned that you've thought throughout this process or from time to time about, giving it up and walking away. And when we were talking before, you had mentioned to me that that wasn't just, a thought in the back of your head, but someone was putting it there. Can you tell folks a little bit about what happened with your, I think you said it was your advisor as you were going through this process? So
if I talk a little bit about my journey,
sure,
which I think will help answer that question, Russ. But sure. I taught for 5 years in a high school setting, as a high school science teacher, and loved every bit of it. Every moment, I come alive when I'm teaching, and that was very hard to walk away from.
That's my first love, by the way. My undergrad studies were in physics and math, and absolutely love it. Still wonder about walking away from astronomy, which was my original graduate work, because it's been a very interesting time over the past 20 years to be an astronomer, all the things that have been going on. So we could geek out about that probably for a long time. But
we absolutely could. Like I have a calculus teacher friend who just retired and has a new fancy telescope that's taking pictures, and he's sending me pictures of all this exciting stuff. And I'm like, why can't I be out there with you? So we could geek out for a long time. But walking away from science, that passion and impressing it upon the high school students was just something that I still love. But I wanted to see if I could make a bigger impact. I think that's why a lot of people go into administration. Right. And after 5 years, I became a middle school principal. And the middle school principal turned into a middle school, high school principal role. And after 2 years, then I landed myself in a superintendency. So things moved extremely fast for me at a very young age. I was first superintendent when I was 31.
Wow.
And that is not, I don't know if it's common. It seems uncommon. Fate, I don't know if the stars aligned, luck.
Right.
And I reflect on, was it too early? That's a question that I often wonder about. But when I took my oral comps, I was a principal, oral and written comps, I was a principal. And then when I became superintendent, that was in conjunction of when I was supposed to start the dissertation.
Okay.
And at that point, then the fourth baby also arrived. So there were 4 babies, and now you fast forward the years back and imagine how young they were.
Right.
And I was in the start-stop phase of writing, and I think my first topic was on the new teacher evaluation system that was happening in Ohio, and wondering what it was doing to teacher efficacy.
Okay.
And were we essentially evaluating out efficacy because of the model that the state was working on?
Right.
That didn't get anywhere. It didn't get off the ground. There were a couple of those ideas that I just recently went through my cabinet and threw old proposals away, which was refreshing. It was exhilarating, actually. But my chair at the time was very much in tune with, I was in this practitioner mode, and I was teacher, principal, superintendent, fast-tracked, and she was encouraging me to take a break for a year and research because she said, you have chosen a PhD.
A break from what?
Oh, good. Thank you for the clarification. Take a sabbatical from being a superintendent for a year and devote yourself to research, because I was pursuing a PhD, and in her mind, that was different from an EDD in that it needed to be more rigorous. You can imagine just the speeches that people talk about. Right, wrong, and different. That was her viewpoint, and she was a wonderful lady and was trying her very best to guide me. But she wanted me to take a year off, and I couldn't.
Right.
Nor did I didn't want to, nor could I financially support my family. And then when the position, you don't hear of superintendents taking a year off. That doesn't happen. Right. That's called getting
positions
fired.
Don't grow on trees, right? You're lucky to get one early on, but that doesn't mean the next one's going to happen.
Yeah, taking a year off
back in the ring.
No longer have a position.
Yeah.
So that wasn't feasible. And then she encouraged me to maybe look for an EDD, because while the Kent State University didn't offer it at that point, she thought that maybe there was another university, or maybe Kent would offer it in the future, and maybe that would be a better fit for me as a practitioner. So after she gave me that speech, as well-intentioned as it was, and as amazing as this individual is, it still took me about a year to recover from that conversation.
Wow. Because
I had a lot of self-doubt then. And I thought maybe this was never going to pan out for some of the reasons she shared. And I'll echo that she didn't do anything out of ill intention. She was really trying to help me. It just didn't jive with what I wanted to do.
Right.
And after my ego healed, it sometimes gets in the way, right? So after that healed, I was even more impassioned to complete the degree.
Right.
And that chair retired. And I was very fortunate to get another chair who agreed to take me on. Mm-hmm. And she had been a sitting superintendent for a period of time. And I think that's what the connection was better. And she understood what the job was from a practitioner as well as from a theorist. Right. And I think that without her, I don't know that I would have, without her and others, but her leadership really made it possible that she wanted to take me on and in my sitting role, and that I didn't have to give up my job. Right. But I think there's times where she thought, Matt, you're running a high performing district. There are things in my job that were taking a great deal of my time. In the last 4 years, we've been working on an $86 million building project, of which I'm one of the owner representatives. And I have 4 children. So there's a lot of reasons why it shouldn't have worked.
Right.
But she was there saying it could work if I was willing to sacrifice some time. I just had to make the personal commitment and also make the choice of what I was going to give up to do this.
Right.
And that was a family conversation of what we could do, because I still wanted a family when this was all over, right? I mean, that's
important. You have to know what your priorities are, right, when you're going into this. And the story that you tell me, it reminds me of, I tell our students all the time, listen, there are as far as I'm concerned, there's a lot of ways you can classify things, but there are two types of doctoral students. One is the traditional doctoral student, and then the other is what I call the unconventional doctoral student. Unconventional, obviously, that's where the name of this podcast came from, because we have folks who are following that path. To me, I define it as anything other than a doctoral student who intends to go into academia. Academia meaning, research, professorship, grant writing, doing research, those things, not administration in education. That's a different industry, so to speak, than academia. And people who go into academia, they follow this path that was set out in the Middle Ages, honestly, with the trade guilds, of this master-apprentice relationship where you're kind of doing your advisor's research for them for a while and learning at the foot of the master, and eventually you take over and you become that master. When that's not your objective and that's not your goal, then you really need to take a different path, and you really need to envision the dissertation differently. That doesn't mean the rigor is different. It just means that the goal for you is to get the degree and move on to these other things that you want to do in your life. Whereas the traditional doctoral student, the degree is just sort of a way station along the way. The goal is to do this research, and whether they're doing it as a student or a postdoc or a assistant professor or a full professor, that's just splitting hair, so to speak. That's just the part that happens along the journey. So I don't know if you identify with that difference at all.
Yeah, no, I absolutely do, and I think that people wondered why I wanted to go after the Ph.D. because that's not what I really wanted to do.
Right.
I chose the Ph.D. because I thought it would be the most rigorous pathway to achieve this goal, and it would open the most doors for whatever I want to do when I grow up. And I hope I'm asking that question for my whole life.
Right.
That's what drew me to the degree. Whether or not it'll make a big difference in the long haul, it certainly didn't make a difference for me to get a superintendency because I had one for a long period of time. It was really my own, personal goal and plight for, I don't know if it's just self-torture or not, but I wanted to pick the most rigorous option because I thought I would grow the most, and I certainly did. But it was unconventional, to steal your word. I did not fit into the boxes or into the mold, and that created strife with the people who were trying to support me on that journey.
The traditionalist people who were trying to support you, because you mentioned
correct.
The mentor before was very traditional, and there's nothing wrong with that at all. She was a good person, well-intentioned, but it's hard to say this in a way that doesn't come across as insulting, and I don't want it to. But basically, there's just a kind of a lack of awareness that there is another way to do things. This is how I grew up, and this is how you're going to grow up, is kind of the mentality. And yes, there's a certain amount of that where you need to be able to display that you can do the same things that your predecessors did. Otherwise, the degree gets diluted and watered down over time, and we don't want that. But at the same time, it doesn't, just because you met the bar in terms of graduating doesn't mean you have to go on and do the same things they did for their life. You can be a superintendent and go on to do other things in the future and be every bit as valuable to society and all of that as your professor who helped you to graduate. And so I think that's why it clicked for you when you had a superintendent who was overseeing your work more so than a researcher and academic.
And I will tell you that I think that during the time when she was advising me that way, I was lost. And I don't know that I was as dedicated as I should be. So while she was advising me that there was a level of work that I was providing for whatever reason that was helping shape that opinion. So I by no means, Russ, want to say that there was anything wrong with the conversation or that it was even not warranted. It's just that's where we were. And I think that conversation then ultimately catapulted me to be able to finish it.
Right.
So I have no ill will about that. And I own the level of work I was producing at that time and not making any excuses for it. I will tell you that also after that conversation, and I licked the wounds, there were a couple people that came into my life that had PhDs, were superintendents, who became close friends, who mentored me in addition to my chair. And I think they are the ones that made it possible in tandem with the chair. So I found other people in my role with PhDs who had done it, who said, Matt, we will meet with you weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, send me what you're writing, just keep writing and we'll talk through it. I had some friends that were willing to do that. So I almost had that support network that came together and coalesced with a new chair that made the difference for me.
And I think that's also very important is in everything that we do in life, you need kind of role models and mentors and people to look up to that have been there before you, and to see that there are other people who've gone through essentially what you're trying to go through right now and been successful and come out the other side. It gives you this tangible sense of hope that I can do it too, as opposed to when you're being, when you're being mentored by someone who is an academic, a traditional doctor, so to speak, traditional doctoral student who turned into an academic. That disconnect there, it makes you maybe a little despondent that I'm not seeing anybody representing me in this process. And so if I'm not represented in this process, I don't know that I can do it. Does that click for you at all? Does that sound right?
Because they gave me the inspiration and inspiration that it can be done and you can be in this role and you don't have to take a traditional approach when it's over.
Right.
And maybe more importantly, they had firsthand experience of what I was going through once the active writing happened.
Right.
And they can say, yes, this is supposed to be this terrible. And yes, it will, like as your soul is dying, and I'm not trying to be over dramatic, but I think your soul does die a little bit in this process because you realize that it's not all your work. It's a combination of a lot of people's viewpoints.
Right.
And you have to be a master negotiator to figure out what's a hill to die on, what's not, and how do you blend a committee's worth of viewpoints and feedback and still stay true to your vision. They help make that possible because there are times where you can't sugarcoat it. Mm-hmm. It's just terrible. And there are times when my timeline, and I think this just helped me grow as a thinker and as a human, my timeline meant nothing. And as a superintendent, as an educational leader over an organization, I'm very much used to being in control of my environment to some degree.
Right.
And I don't have control. And there are times when I was not demonstrating success, and I have never felt so poorly about my writing than in this process. It's just a breaking down or a wearing down of you as a human is not so much as if you're smart. This is just my viewpoint, okay? So everybody has their own.
Sure.
But I think this exercise is not an exercise in are you smart? I think it's assumed that you have some level of intelligence before you get in. This is an exercise in how many times will you get up after you've been pushed down.
I think you hit on a number of really important points there. Number one, you had people around you who had been through this before. And one of my students from the early days of dissertation done, her dissertation was actually on the types of support you need to complete a dissertation when you're not immersed in a university community. So if you're not a traditional doctoral student there at a desk, you've left your job and you're just, sitting at a desk with other graduate students pounding out your dissertation. If you're not in that environment, then there's no normality to what you're doing at all. You probably don't know anybody else who's doing what you're doing in that case. And to have other people around you who can emotionally tell you, yes, it's terrible now, but it'll get better. And you can believe them because they've been there before. They know what they're talking about is really important. But then why was it terrible? Well, it's because you weren't a doctor when you started the dissertation process, because that dissertation process is transformative. And you're, in a sense, a different person when you finish it. So when you talk about, your soul dying, it's a interesting way of saying it, but it's growing pains. I think it's in a sense, the quote child that you were, in this doctoral journey is giving way to an adult in this doctoral journey. And I'm talking about in this transition of being able to conduct research, being able to stand on your own feet and all those sorts of things. But then you mentioned that the complication is not just you want to go out there and do this on your own, but now you have to do it in front of a committee of people and come to this realization, either explicitly or implicitly, that the dissertation isn't actually yours, it's theirs. You've got to get them to be happy with it in order for you to graduate. Doesn't matter if you're happy with it in the end or not. Once they say it's good, then you're done. But you know, like you said, trying to keep your vision while simultaneously getting this to the point where they will all approve it and they will all be happy with it is a skill set to its own. So I have a couple. Yeah, I have a couple things that I want to rattle on just about what you just said. One, I think that if you're I don't know if you're familiar with an Enneagram. So the Enneagram is a personality test that's been done since the beginning of time. And I'm an 8 Enneagram, which is called the Challenger, which is really good sometimes and really bad. And the Enneagram personality test is different from others, where it tells you your shortcomings. And once you're aware of your shortcomings, then you can try to be a better human because of it. So as a Challenger, I have a really hard time with somebody telling me what to do. And if I disagree with it, then it just amps up about 100 times. So I had to learn to let things go and to pick my fights very quickly. And there was almost a little bit of a defeatist attitude for me because I knew I had to do that. And I felt like at times, not at the end, but at times during the journey, that this wasn't my work. And it was hard for me to reconcile with. And I eventually came out of that to realize it was my work, but there was still a lot of jockeying. The second thing I would say is that when you talked about this, how you change as a human, and I use your soul dies a little bit. Maybe a better way to say it is that there was somebody talking about a book called Courage, Dear Heart, and I haven't read it yet, but there's a biologist who's writing, and it talks about in the journey from a caterpillar to a butterfly. I'll go back to my science geeking, okay? If you were to cut open the cocoon, it's a protein soup. So everything kind of dissolves and it reforms into the butterfly. Yeah. So the dissertation phase, you become a protein soup, and you're in this kind of chaos, and then you come out as a completely different person, without being overly dramatic. But there are so many things that change because of this exercise of who you are, like reprograms you in some ways. Yeah, and I think that there's a lot of that. Looking at the world in a different way, looking at problem solving in a different way, looking at information that you're provided in a different way. In your job as superintendent, you may have gotten to be a very critical consumer of information already, but going through a Ph.D. process, you have to be a very critical consumer of information. And so a lot of those things, you're right, develop and you're very different in a lot of ways after you've gone through that process. An analogy I have to your previous point about it feeling like it wasn't your work in a sense, I like to tell students that you should think of yourself as a home builder, literally a hammer and nails, the builder, but you're building a home, custom building a home for a buyer who is paying for it. And it's not a spec home that you make the way you want to make it. It's got to meet their specifications. And so although it's yours and it's your work and you're putting the blood, sweat, and tears into it, it's got to be the way they want it, or else it doesn't happen. Same as if you were like a clothes designer and you're building a suit of clothes, but you have to tailor it to fit just right. That's kind of the sense. Your name's on the label, you're the builder, your name's on the title page of your dissertation. But in a real sense, the owners are going to be the committee. And it's a tough thing to deal with during parts of the process, absolutely. But if you can accept that kind of mentality and kind of yield a little bit, which I think, like you, it's hard to do sometimes, especially when you're passionate about something. But if you can sort of professionally detach from the dissertation and get it out there and deliver it as a professional, you can get through that process a little bit more easily. And then you can do what you want to do afterwards, because you don't have a committee once you get that DR title. You don't have a committee telling you what to do anymore. Right. It's the beginning, not the end. Yeah. And yeah, absolutely. Best dissertation is the done dissertation, as they say. So you mentioned that you're in the process of taking your dissertation work and sort of popularizing it. I know that down the line there's a book that you're interested in. You're working on a blog currently. Tell us a little bit about that. What's been happening since you graduated?
So right now, there's a quiet calm, and I don't know that I like it. So I'm playing school with my district during the pandemic, and things are relatively stabilized right now. Yeah. Thankfully so. I'm knocking on wood when I say that. We're in school 5 days a week, which is not common across the country, but we're doing it, and we're demonstrating cautious success. I mentioned that
tell us a little bit more about that. I want to get to what we were talking about, but tell us a little bit more about that, because I know that there are going to be superintendents and principals who are listening in on this. And you mentioned that you were in a conference recently where you got to see some different ways people are handling it. What can you tell us about that right now as we are still in this pandemic at this point?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the most challenging things that I've ever experienced as a leader, and I think many leaders would echo that same statement. Mm-hmm. And I will say that there's not a one-size-fits-all, and you have the pleasure of serving a unique community that is nuanced, and every leader is just trying to do their best. Right. Yesterday, I served on a small panel of one district that was all remote, one district that represented a hybrid plan, and I represented a 5 days a week. Mm-hmm. And we each had compelling reasons of why we had selected as a community that mode of instruction. Mm-hmm. Our district has decided that 5 days a week all in is something that would fit our needs in the area of Ohio that I'm serving in. And we have 87% of our population coming to brick and mortar 5 days a week with 3 feet social distancing, all in masks, with cleaning protocols and temperature screenings and all of those elements. But we're in week 5 of instruction right now. And I'm knock on wood one more time, we've had 0 positive cases and 0 kids in quarantine from community spread, or from school community spread. So we're lucky in many ways, but I also think that the community is taking this seriously because it is a group effort. And we have a system built out that we can transcend from all in to hybrid or an every other day model, and then all remote should the cases and the quarantining increase, which could happen. Right. But right now things are going cautiously well, but it never feels like it's. I
think you have the right
better
to say that at this point too. 1 week, 2 weeks it's in, maybe you don't know, but 5 weeks in, there's something happening there. There's some good news to get 5 weeks in.
I hope so, and I think that there are districts that are all remote that are doing really well, and there's districts that are hybrid that are doing really well. I don't think that it is in our best interest to compare and contrast from one district to the next, because I think that every district has its unique needs, and everybody has to find what works well within their community and then develop a plan that meets it. So that's interesting, because right now it feels like it's calmer where that's concerned. It hasn't been calm since March. Mm-hmm. The second thing is that we're just finishing a 4-year, $86 million building project, and that just it's in the tail end, so that's calmer as well. And then the dissertation is over. So I'm kind of left with I've got my day job, right, which I love dearly, but I'm wondering what's next. Right. And I have some idle time, and I don't do very well in an idle situation. My wife will tell you it's never good when I'm idle. I always get myself in trouble. Like if there's not a crisis, I'll create one just for fun to see what happens. It's not an endearing quality. Yeah.
So that we have that in common as well. I have I don't remember who it was, but I remember listening to someone talk about some different psychological archetypes, and I hadn't heard this before, but he identified one of those archetypes as being the hunter. So he talked about this in terms of like early hunter-gatherer society. What types of people did we have back then? And one was the hunter. And the hunter is always on the hunt. If you make the kill and everybody's eating, great, but it's time for the next hunt. Yeah. And that's kind of how I feel. I remember seeing people, winning the Super Bowl or the World Series or something, and they're so incredibly elated, and it's like they're all in that moment right then. And I just know if I was there, I'd be like, okay, we got to do this again next year. That would be my attitude rather than this, presence. And so I liked hearing that talk, because it made some sense to me why I act the way I do in some cases, I think.
I'm trying to enjoy the calm. And so what I'm focusing on right now is is there a way to turn the dissertation into a book?
Yeah.
So I'm talking with some folks that can help me in that area.
Awesome.
And my research was on what is the effect of superintendent vision on digital learning. And it coincided with, so when this was defended in May, we're in the throes of the pandemic, we're still in the throes of the pandemic, when districts were faced with the challenge of going brick and mortar to remote or all digital in a matter of days.
Right.
So I am hoping to intertwine the pandemic with that importance of vision in how it's transforming schools. While I'm letting that I'm throwing that idea out into the universe, I'm trying to blog about what I'm thinking right now. So there's time for me to just write about any given topic, and I post those on Twitter and LinkedIn, but it's just random topics. Like this week's blog is going to be on social media and our role as parents and as teachers and educators for not only ourselves, but for the folks that we serve. So I recently watched the Netflix documentary, The Social Dilemma, and it really just spurred conversations in my own house and also in the schoolhouse to figure out what it means for us. Well, we're still giving speeches to parents that say you can monitor your child's social media accounts. You have the ability to do so.
Right.
And as crazy as this sounds, they don't need to have a social media account. So it's an interesting world that parents are trying to live in, myself included, and also as an educator. So I'm using that blog as the space for me to just generate thoughts about, it's helping me to write. And it's also allowing me to wrap my head around some ideas that are swirling in my head.
Good. Yeah, that one's on my watch list.
But it's a process.
That one's on my watch list as well. So it sounds like you recommend. Is that something to watch and bring ideas back to the family, or is it something to watch as a family?
It depends on how old the family is. Like I didn't have my 10-year-old watch it. If you have teenagers, I'd say yes.
Yeah.
And then dialogue about it.
Right.
It is. It's just powerful. And you take any documentary with you have to put in the context. I'm the type of person that reads multiple news sources around the same topic to try to distill common threads.
Yep.
And maybe that goes back to your idea of a critical consumer. But you have to keep that. You're also looking at somebody's paradigm, and
right.
You acknowledge that there's many different paradigms.
Yeah. Unfortunately, we are getting to the point where you just about have to be a Ph.D. to read the news anymore, because you've got to look at all of these biases that come into the news source and the reporting, and distill those out by looking for those common threads, like you said.
There's sometimes you just want to turn it all off.
Just read the news to us anymore.
Yeah, and you can trust it. So, and I find myself telling I want to dive in, and there's other times where I want to turn it all off.
Yeah,
and I try to balance between the two.
Well, so what else do you think? What's next on the journey? Now that I understand that the dissertation is still large in the rearview mirror, but as it's receding, have you got any other thoughts about what's going to fill that void?
Yeah, so I definitely want to write the book.
Yeah,
I want to ultimately, hopefully, get the opportunity to speak and engage with other districts that are focused on transformative instructional practices. So I want to somehow make an impact on a global scale, with conversations around how is there a better way to play school? Okay. What have we learned? And if from this recent pandemic, and what's going to stay the same and what's going to change?
Right.
And I think that those will be interesting dialogues, and I want to make a positive impact. Right now, I'm envisioning is I need a book to be able to open doors in terms of speaking engagements. Right. Not a book to make money from, but to open doors. Just like the Ph.D., I think, opens doors. So I'm looking for, when I matriculated from a teacher to a principal, and I thought I wanted to make a bigger impact there. And then when I was a principal, I want to become a superintendent. Now as a superintendent, I want to look at, is there other ways to increase the influence to engage in meaningful work of positively impacting children?
Yeah. And that idea of having that book out there to open doors and to help start conversations, I think is spot on. That's we're doing that with a lot of our own students from Dissertation Done now. That once the shackles that your dissertation committee puts on you are off, and you've defended and earned your degree, now go out and write the book that you really wanted to write for your dissertation, whether it's the exact same message or maybe a little different because you're popularizing it. I found that to be a really enjoyable exercise, because it's a less restrained and constrained than the work on the dissertation, certainly.
And I'm a little worried, just for us to see, and maybe your folks that you work with have said the same thing. It was painful for me to turn into a research writer. Mm-hmm. And some people still on the committee wanted me to be drier, and I felt like I couldn't get any more dry. And now I'm a little worried about going back into the general populace and finding a way to get back into a writer that's not from solely research. And that's why I think the blogging is helping me right now.
Yeah.
It's like an old really personal exercise.
Because they're very different styles. When you're writing for a book that you publish, you want to have a conversational style. You want people to want to turn the page and read it. They're not getting paid to turn the pages like your committee is. So, you want them to stay engaged and want to read that material. But I had the same journey with my first research papers. I would read these research papers and talk to my advisor and say, these people seem like geniuses. I mean, how do you come up with all of this stuff? And he talked about how, it's a long process, and on and on and on. And I told him, I want to show that process. I want to make it easier for people to access the work. And so I started doing that. And I was an undergraduate at the time. It was it was an awesome experience. I was able to work with a researcher doing real research. We actually published the work that I did as an undergrad. But there was this evolution where he let me do that. And then he said, well, don't you understand how it's confusing that we told him this little story? Because it failed. And they're getting involved in it. And when that failed, now they're like, And I was like, yeah, but that's what I felt. And he's like, yeah, but you're teaching now. You're not telling your life story. You're teaching now. And eventually that writing style got to be drier and drier, and it was exactly what everybody else was writing by the time we published it. But he let me come to that in a kind of a didactic way of being successful with writing what I wanted to, and then him saying, well, here's why we don't want to do that, and I could understand what he was saying. And then it was a little bit of a challenge to turn around and then be more conversational and include anecdotes and that sort of thing when I began writing outside of academia.
When I began writing for the dissertation, those trusted colleagues that I talked about, they said, just keep writing.
Yeah.
So I wrote, and then, like you described it, transformed into research writing. So right. I'm viewing the blog as the reversal, or a blended approach. Just keep writing.
Yeah. No, it's true. Practice makes permanent, as they say. So whatever you practice, if you practice being more conversational, you'll get there. And the blog, I'm sure, is a way to do that. So that sounds really good. In terms of next things, is there anything else, any final parting words you might have for our audience about the future, the past, or anything in this journey?
I'm just reflecting. It was one of the sweetest moments in my life when I finished.
Yeah.
So when they said Dr. Montgomery, even though you knew it was coming, it was a very sweet moment in my life. And it is one of those things that I will always look back fondly on, or I imagine I will. Yeah. And I don't want to put it in the same, I mean, it's a milestone, like, when the day of your wedding day, the day of your children's birth. And I don't want to say that the dissertation is that important, because my family always will trump any of those experiences, but it is akin to those types of experiences. And the moment that it's over, the stress melts away. Yeah. And I was listening to somebody talk, I don't know, sometime this week, and they were talking about, if you can tell me about your high school experience. So fast forward 20, 30 years, whatever. Tell me who you were as a high schooler and what was your experience. And people can usually synthesize their high school experience in 1 to 2 sentences. But when you go back and you were living it, you could have talked about it nonstop about how it was consuming your life.
Right.
And I imagine that when you fast forward beyond the dissertation, the sentences are going to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that is just a moment in time in your life that you got through, much like this pandemic, I think, will be. Where, yes, we lived through it, and it's 1 or 2 sentences of our life. So I say all that because as difficult as the process is, when it's over, it's worth it. And that's easy to say. But it really is, I really believe it. I would do it again if I could, or if I had to. I just would know it would be messy and horrible and terrible and everything that goes with chaos and order. We're back to physics.
So
back to science.
If you're in that phase of your life right now, as you're listening to this, I'll quote Winston Churchill: "If you're going through hell, keep going. Don't stop. Keep going. You will get through it, and it's worth it coming out the other side. It's worth it for that moment of being addressed as Dr. You, but also for all the opportunities it opens up subsequent to that."
Yeah, and the last thing I'll say is, and I like to talk, so Russ, you can tell me to be quiet anytime, but I ran 4 marathons before I wrote the dissertation. Right. And I was never a runner. And my wife said that if I run another marathon before I write a dissertation, we're going to have problems. So my 5th marathon was a dissertation, but the dissertation is so the marathon is a great analogy for a dissertation.
Right.
And I think training for a marathon helped me, and I'm not advocating everybody go run for a marathon, but it helped my mindset of all that training for a year or more for one day. Mm-hmm. And the analogy of then in the race, there were times when my friends would say, "You're in mile 22 right now of the dissertation experience."
Right.
So you have to understand that it's a long, messy process, and there's going to be lots of times when you're not going to want to take one step forward. But to build on Churchill, you need to keep moving forward. It's worth it.
And just like the marathon, I mean, it's certainly physical, but so much of it is psychological. I have, during this pandemic, set up a little kind of gym in the garage and got to really recommitted myself to working out, which is something I let go for a while. But before this, after I had kids, that was one of the things that kind of fell to the side for a while. And a lot of knowing what I want to do and having marked out, this is what I'm going to do today in the gym. I'm sitting there talking to myself like, okay, just go do it. While I'm there, do the next one, do the next set. You can do it. You're not walking out of here until you finish doing it. Do the next one. And it's tough, but keep talking to yourself, keep willing yourself through it. Perseverance, along with some guidance and instruction. You have to know what you're doing. If I was lifting weights with my pinky or something like that, I'm lifting 100 pounds, it's never going to come off the ground. So you do have to know what you're doing, but beyond that, perseverance, just keep going is what gets you there.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah. Well, listen, Dr. Montgomery, tell folks how to engage with you. I know that you said you wanted to start a conversation with other superintendents and other folks in education about these ideas that you've learned about in your dissertation and how we can continue to serve our children. How can they reach you, and what's the best way to do that?
I think the easiest way is through Twitter at @SoupMontgomery. I'm also on LinkedIn, as well as you can just contact me at my district office, which is mmontgomery@revereschools.org. Any of those, I would be more than willing to talk through, ideas that you have, or if you just need a conversation of, yes, I acknowledge this does suck right now, and it will get better. I'm definitely willing to engage in thoughtful dialogue.
Awesome. We'll include that on our show notes if anybody who's listening wants to go to dissertationdone.com and check out the blog. The show notes will be there, but it's @Supt Montgomery. That's SUPT Montgomery is the Twitter handle, and like I said, we'll get all those points of contact in the show notes so that people can reach out to you and continue this conversation.
Thanks again, Russ. I really appreciate it and have enjoyed the conversation.
Awesome. I want to just let folks know once again that this episode today has been brought to you by Dissertation Done. If you're working on the dissertation process, if you're in the middle of this journey and could use some guidance, support, direction, and so forth, check us out, dissertationdone.com/done. And if you're out there living your unconventional life, and you want to turn your message into a book so that you can expand your own authority and you can take that next step and further your own reach. Check us out at dissertationdone.com/book. We'd love to have you on that journey with us as well. Dr. Montgomery, thank you again so much for being here. It's been a real pleasure. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing for our kids, because that is truly important work. You mentioned a calling before. I truly believe that it's something that does good in this world, and I appreciate you for doing that. Thank you so much.
Thanks again. Have a great rest of your day.
All right. You're welcome. And for those of you out there listening, go out and live your unconventional life.
This has been An Unconventional Life. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, subscribe now to keep getting inspirational stories of unconventional lives as soon as they're released. Until then, go out and live your best unconventional life.